Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now, get comfortable and relax. My name is Tom Grayson. I'm a journalist, or at least I was. I've covered all kinds of stories. Murders, disappearances, small-town scandals no one outside of a 20-mile radius would care about. I've heard my fair share of ghost stories, too, usually from old folks looking to make their town seem more interesting than it really is. But I don't believe in that kind of thing. Or at least, I didn't. In the fall of 1976, I was sent to a town in Kansas, Ashford, population 312. I was supposed to look into a string of disappearances, people vanishing without a trace, leaving behind empty houses and unfinished meals on kitchen tables. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. The police reports were thin, the local sheriff uninterested in talking to outsiders. But the thing that really caught my attention? Every missing person's farm had the same scarecrow standing in their fields, same patchwork clothes, same hollow eyes made of black buttons, same twisted grin stitched into burlap. That first night, as I drove into town, the air felt wrong. Not cold, not exactly, but heavy, thick with the scent of dry earth and rotting leaves. The kind of air that makes you feel like you're being watched. The town itself looked normal at first glance. A main street lined with brick buildings, a diner with flickering neon lights, a church standing tall against the darkening sky. But something was missing. People. There were cars parked along the road, lights glowing behind windows, but the streets were empty. No kids playing, no couples strolling, no old men smoking on their porches. Just silence, stretching out like a held breath. I pulled up to the only motel, a squat little thing with 6 rooms and a buzzing sign that read, "Vacancy." The woman at the front desk barely looked at me as she slid the key across the counter. When I asked about the disappearances, she just shook her head. "Best not to go looking for things that don't want to be found," she said. I wanted to push, to pry the truth out of her, but something about the way she spoke made me stop. Like she wasn't warning me, she was reminding me. I took my key and headed to my room. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots. The wallpaper curled at the edges, the scent of dust and stale air thick in my nose. I set my bag down, pulled out my notebook, and started writing. And that's when I heard it. A soft, rustling sound just outside the window. Not the wind, not leaves. Something deliberate. I turned slowly, my breath tight in my chest, and looked out into the dark. The field stretched out beyond the parking lot, rows of withered corn stalks swaying in the breeze. And in the middle of it, standing perfectly still, was a scarecrow. It hadn't been there before. I stared out the window, my fingers tightening around the edge of my notebook as my brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The scarecrow stood there, motionless, its tattered clothes shifting slightly in the breeze. The moon cast long, thin shadows across the field, and for a moment, I tried to convince myself that maybe I had just missed it before. Maybe I hadn't been paying attention when I pulled into the motel. Maybe it had always been there, watching over the dying corn stalks like any normal scarecrow would. But something about it felt wrong. It was too tall, its frame too thin, its arms hanging at an angle that seemed unnatural. as if the sticks holding it up had been twisted just a little too far. Its head was tilted slightly downward, its button eyes staring directly at my window. The longer I looked, the more my skin crawled, an itchy, unsettled feeling creeping up the back of my neck. I turned away, rubbing at my face, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a scarecrow, a bundle of straw and old clothes, nothing more. I'd been driving for hours. My mind was playing tricks on me, making shadows into something they weren't. Still, I closed the curtains. The room felt smaller with the window covered, the silence stretching out again, pressing in on me from all sides. I sat on the edge of the bed, flipping through my notes, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the field outside. I told myself not to look again, that there was no point, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I stood up, hesitated, then walked back to the window. Slowly, I pulled the curtain aside just an inch, just enough to peek through. The scarecrow was closer. Not much, just a few feet forward, but it was unmistakable. It had moved. A cold sweat broke out across my back. My hands felt numb, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. There was no wind strong enough to push something like that across the dirt. No reason it should be standing differently than it had been just moments ago. I stepped back from the window, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe someone was out there, playing a prank. Maybe the townsfolk had heard. An outsider was poking around and decided to have a little fun with me. That had to be it. But even as I told myself that, I knew deep down that wasn't the answer. I forced myself to sit back down, to focus, to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease clawing at my insides. I flipped to a fresh page in my notebook, determined to go over the facts. The disappearances, the identical scarecrows, the way the town refused to talk about it. But then I heard it again, rustling, closer this time. And then, a soft tap against the window. The sound was soft, almost delicate, but it might as well have been a gunshot in the dead silence of that room. A single tap against the window, followed by nothing. No wind, no footsteps, just stillness. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the curtain, at the faint outline of the window behind it, my mind racing to rationalize what I had just heard. Maybe a branch had hit the glass. Maybe it was a bird, though I hadn't seen any since I arrived in this god-forsaken town. Maybe another tap. Louder this time, more deliberate. My stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed at me not to look, not to pull back the curtain, not to confirm the thing I already knew deep down. That the scarecrow had moved again. That it was standing right outside my window. I sat there frozen, listening to the blood pounding in my ears, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. I could almost convince myself that if I just stayed still, if I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would go away. Then the third tap came. Slow, rhythmic. I forced myself to move. My muscles felt sluggish, like I was wading through thick water, but I pushed myself off the bed, creeping toward the window with careful, measured steps. My pulse roared in my ears as I reached out, my fingers barely brushing the edge of the curtain. I hesitated. Then, with one quick motion, I pulled it back. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the reflection of my own pale face in the glass. My wide, tired eyes staring back at me. But then I noticed the shape, just barely visible at the edge of the window frame. The scarecrow was standing right outside, closer than it should have been, close enough that I could see the rough stitching on its burlap face, the black buttons sewn unevenly where eyes should be. Close enough that I could see its hands, if you could call them that, nothing but dried straw poking through old work gloves, pressed against the glass, close enough that I could see its mouth. I had thought it was just a stitched grin, an old piece of fabric pulled too tight, curling at the edges. But now, as I stared, I saw the fabric shifting, the stitches tugging, the mouth slowly stretching into something wider, something hungry. A breath hitched in my throat. My hand shot out before I could think, grabbing the curtain and yanking it shut, shoving myself backward until my legs hit the edge of the bed. I sat down hard, my hands trembling as I gripped the mattress. No, that wasn't possible. It wasn't real. It was some kind of trick, some awful joke played by the townsfolk to scare me off. It had to be. I forced myself to breathe, in and out, focusing on the steady rhythm, willing my heart to slow. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I told myself I wouldn't check again. I wouldn't look. And then I heard it. Not a tap this time. A creaking sound, slow and deliberate. The sound of my motel door unlocking. The sound sent a jolt of pure terror through me, a slow, deliberate creak as the motel door lock slid free. My breath caught, my body tensing so hard I thought my ribs might crack. I hadn't moved from the bed. I hadn't touched the door. There was no one else in the room. And yet, the lock had turned. For a long, terrible second, nothing happened. The door didn't swing open. No footsteps followed. Just silence, stretching out so thick and suffocating that I could hear the faint ringing in my ears. My mind scrambled for explanations, but none of them made sense. Had I forgotten to lock it? Had the old building shifted, the metal giving way on its own? That was possible, wasn't it? Then, slowly, the doorknob turned. I shot up from the bed, my heart hammering against my ribs as I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the corner of the nightstand. My notebook and pen clattered to the floor, but I barely heard them over the blood rushing in my ears. The doorknob twisted all the way, the latch clicking free, and the door didn't open. Whoever was on the other side was waiting. I held my breath, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I stood frozen, staring at the door, watching the knob as if it might suddenly snap off in some unseen grip. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, finally, the door creaked, open an inch, just enough for darkness to spill in through the gap. I didn't think. I lunged forward, slamming my hand against the door and shoving it shut with all my strength. The old wood rattled in its frame as I fumbled for the lock, twisting it hard until I heard the bolt slide back into place. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, my hands shaking as I braced my weight against the door, half expecting whatever was outside to slam against it, to push back. But nothing happened. The silence was worse than if it had. I swallowed hard, pressing my ear to the wood, listening for any movement. The hall outside was dead quiet. No footsteps. No breathing. Nothing. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped back, my legs unsteady beneath me. And then I remembered the window. I turned sharply, my stomach twisting into knots as I faced it. The curtain was still drawn, but that didn't mean anything. I hadn't heard movement, but I hadn't heard the door unlock either. And yet it had. I forced myself forward, my pulse hammering in my throat as I reached out. My fingers trembled as I took hold of the curtain, hesitated for half a second, then yanked it aside. The scarecrow was gone. For one stupid, fleeting moment, relief washed over me. But it didn't last. The field was empty now, but that didn't mean it had left. It only meant that I didn't know where it was. And then something outside caught my eye. Something in the dirt, right below the window. Deep, sunken impressions, side by side, dragging toward the door. Footprints. Not boots, not shoes. Straw. I stared at the tracks in the dirt, my breath shallow and uneven. The prints were deep, long grooves in the soil where something had dragged itself forward. The pattern uneven, unnatural, as if whatever made them hadn't been walking but pulling itself step by step. My stomach twisted as my eyes followed the path they made, leading straight to my motel door. I had locked it. I was sure of that. I had heard the bolt slide into place, felt the wood rattle beneath my palms when I pressed against it. But that didn't change the fact that something had come all the way up to my room, that something had tried to get inside. I stepped back from the window, my hands shaking at my sides, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe I was seeing things, imagining patterns where there were none, letting the fear crawl into my brain and twist reality. I needed to leave. Now. Before my nerves got the better of me, before I started believing that the impossible was real. I grabbed my bag, throwing it over my shoulder, not bothering to check if I had packed everything. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of this room, out of this town, away from the fields and the empty streets and the too still silence pressing in around me. My hand closed around the doorknob, and for a moment I hesitated. What if it was still out there? I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to step outside and find myself face to face with whatever had left those tracks in the dirt. But I couldn't stay here. I had no choice. I turned the knob and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by a single buzzing light bulb, casting long shadows across the cracked linoleum. The air was heavy, stale, thick with the scent of dust, and something else. Something faintly rotten, like old hay left to decay in the sun. I forced myself to step forward, my boots echoing too loudly against the floor. The motel lobby was deserted. The woman from earlier was gone, no sign of her behind the front desk, as if she had never been there at all. Outside, my car sat where I had left it, but something about it felt wrong. The windows were fogged, the windshield smeared with something dark, almost like soot. I moved quickly, yanking the driver's side door open, shoving my bag onto the passenger seat, turning the key in the ignition before I had even buckled my seatbelt. The engine roared to life, a familiar sound, grounding me, snapping me back to reality. I was getting out of here. I slammed the car into reverse, tires skidding against the loose gravel as I pulled out of the parking lot, my hands gripping the wheel too tight. I didn't look back at the motel. I didn't look at the fields. I just focused on the road, on the dark ribbon of asphalt stretching out in front of me, leading me away from Ashford. But 20 minutes later, I saw the sign again. Welcome to Ashford. Population 312. My stomach dropped. I slammed on the brakes, gravel spraying up around my tires as my car skidded to a stop. That wasn't possible. I had been driving straight. I hadn't turned once. But somehow, I was back where I started. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The road stretched ahead of me, the same empty town waiting beyond. The fields on either side of the highway stood motionless in the moonlight. But something was different now. The scarecrows were closer. Lined up along the edge of the fields, standing stiff and silent, their button eyes gleaming in the dark. Watching. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't go back. There had to be another way out. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding forward, past the sign, past the empty buildings, past the motel that still had its flickering vacancy sign glowing in the window. I drove until my hands ached from gripping the wheel, until my eyes burned from staring at the road. And then I saw the sign again. Welcome to Ashford. Population 312. This time, I didn't stop. I kept driving, my pulse pounding in my skull, my throat tight with panic. But no matter how far I went, no matter which turn I took, the town kept bringing me back. The roads bent in impossible ways, looping in on themselves, trapping me inside like a rat in a maze. I don't know how long I drove. Hours, maybe. But at some point, exhaustion took over. My vision blurred, my thoughts scattered, and I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, I wasn't in my car anymore. I was in the field, lying on my back, staring up at the stars. My arms felt heavy, my body stiff, like I had been there for a long time. The night air was thick with the scent of dirt and straw, and when I tried to move, I couldn't. I turned my head, panic clawing at my throat, and that's when I saw them. The scarecrows. Standing in a perfect circle around me, their button eyes locked onto mine, their stitched mouths stretched into wide, unmoving grins. I wanted to scream, to get up, to run, but my limbs wouldn't obey. Something held me in place. I looked down at my hands. They weren't my hands anymore. They were made of straw. The scarecrows hadn't been watching me. They had been waiting. And now I was one of them. My name is David Mercer, and I'm a film archivist. It's my job to restore and preserve old films, making sure they don't fade into history. I spend my days in a dimly lit basement, surrounded by stacks of forgotten reels, the air thick with the scent of dust and celluloid. There's a certain peace in it, an escape from the world above. At least that's what I used to think. It started with a routine inventory. The university had acquired a collection from a private estate. Hundreds of reels, some dating back to the early 1900s. I had just begun sorting through them when I found it. A single reel, unmarked, tucked away in a rusted metal canister. The film stock was old, 1920s, maybe earlier. The edges were brittle, the smell stronger than usual, like something rotting beneath the celluloid. I should have logged it and moved on, but something about it called to me. So I threaded it onto the projector. The bulb flickered to life, casting a trembling glow on the screen. The film began. Grainy, silent, the frame jittering with age. At first, it was nothing unusual. A man in old-fashioned clothes, standing in a room with heavy drapes. He looked stiff, unnatural, as if he were being held in place. Then something changed. His mouth opened in a silent scream. I felt a chill run through me as his body convulsed. Dark lines spread across his skin, like cracks in porcelain. Then, suddenly, his head snapped back at an impossible angle. The film cut to black. I sat frozen. My hands trembled. The projectors were the only sound in the room. I told myself it had to be a staged effect, an early horror film, perhaps. But something about it felt too real. And then, the projector kept running. The film had ended, but the reel was still turning. I stepped closer, heart pounding. The screen remained black, yet the clicking of the film continued. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Not from the speakers. This film had no sound. It came from the darkness beyond the screen, curling around me like a breath against my ear. I spun around. Nothing. Just rows of shelves, reels stacked like tombstones. I turned back to the screen. The film was still running. And then, a new image flickered to life. A figure, standing in a dimly lit room. My heart slammed against my ribs. The image was grainy, distorted, but I could make out details. The room. It looked like my archive. The shelves, the projector, and the figure. He was sitting where I was sitting, wearing my clothes, looking straight ahead. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The figure on the screen slowly turned his head toward me. I killed the projector. The room plunged into silence. For a long time, I didn't move. My pulse pounded in my ears, every nerve on edge. Then I forced myself to laugh. A weak, shaky sound. Just a coincidence. A trick of my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. That film wasn't supposed to exist, and I had just watched something I could never unsee. I sat in the silence of the archive room, my hands still gripping the edge of my desk, my breath shallow and uneven. The darkness pressed in around me, the only source of light coming from the projector's lamp, now flickering as if it were struggling to stay alive. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that the film was nothing more than an old piece of experimental cinema. But my body refused to believe it. My skin was clammy, my pulse hammering against my temples. I could still see that grainy image in my mind, my own reflection, staring back at me from a film that should have been decades old. I had to prove to myself that it wasn't real. That was the only way I'd be able to sleep tonight. With shaking hands, I rewound the reel, careful not to let the fragile film snap under my fingers. I kept telling myself that when I played it again, the footage would be different, that I had simply imagined seeing myself on the screen. The logical part of my mind clung to that explanation like a lifeline, even as the rest of me screamed to leave it alone. I pressed play. The whir of the projector filled the room once more, the reel spinning, the flickering light casting jittery shadows against the walls. The film began again. The same man from before appearing in that dimly lit room, his stiff posture, his silent scream, the unnatural way his body contorted. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to watch, to analyze every detail. His movements were so disturbingly lifelike, his pain so visceral that I found myself gripping the arms of my chair, muscles tensed, as if I could somehow brace myself against what was coming next. And then the screen went black. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The reel still turned. The same eerie, dragging sound of the film running through the projector without an image. I swallowed hard, glancing over my shoulder, before forcing my attention back to the screen. The blackness stretched on for too long, making my stomach twist with an irrational but undeniable sense of dread. Then, the image flickered back to life. I was looking at the archive room again, my archive room, the projector, the shelves, the desk where I sat. And there, in the center of the frame, was a figure. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. It was me. The grainy, distorted figure was sitting in my chair, in the exact same posture I was in now. The film was still silent, but I could feel something, an unbearable weight pressing against my chest, the sensation of unseen eyes watching me, waiting for me to react. On the screen, my doppelganger began to move. Slowly, his head tilted to the side, his gaze locking onto mine. My entire body tensed. I could feel my own head tilting in the same direction, mirroring the motion without meaning to. A cold sweat broke out along the back of my neck as I gripped the armrests, forcing myself to stay put to break the connection. Then, suddenly, the screen flickered, and the figure smiled. Not a natural smile, not even a cruel or menacing one. It was too wide, too stretched, as if his face were splitting apart at the seams. His lips pulled back, exposing teeth that looked too sharp, too jagged, like broken glass. I scrambled back, knocking over my chair as the film jumped and stuttered. The image of my twisted double remained frozen for a split second, then distorted, flickering with streaks of shadow and static. I reached out blindly, fumbling for the projector switch, desperate to turn it off. My fingers found the switch and yanked it down. Darkness swallowed the room. For a moment, there was nothing but my ragged breathing and the echo of my own heartbeat. The silence was suffocating, thick and oppressive, as if the darkness itself had weight. I reached for the desk lamp, my fingers trembling, and switched it on. A weak, flickering glow filled the room, pushing back the shadows just enough for me to see that I was alone. The film reel had stopped spinning. The tail end of the film flapped noiselessly against the reel. My mind struggled to process what had just happened, to make sense of the impossible. It had to be some kind of trick, an anomaly in the film, an illusion created by the flickering light, my tired mind twisting the images into something more sinister than they really were. And yet, I could still feel it. That lingering sensation of being watched, of something unseen lingering just beyond the edges of the light. My own reflection in the blank screen seemed darker than it should have been, as though the shadows clung to it just a little too long. I needed to get out of this room. With shaking hands, I grabbed the reel and shoved it back into its metal canister, snapping the lid shut with more force than necessary. The film had to be examined, documented properly, but I couldn't bring myself to do it now. Not tonight. I turned off the projector, gathered my things, and hurried out of the archive room, flicking the light switch as I went. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed and flickered before finally dying out, plunging the room into darkness. As I locked the door behind me, I swore I heard the projector whir back to life. I barely remember the walk home that night. My legs moved on their own, carrying me through the quiet streets, my breath still uneven, my thoughts an incoherent mess. The night air should have been crisp, refreshing even, but it felt thick, heavy, like I was wading through something unseen. Every step I took, every shadow cast by the streetlights, every rustling sound from an alley or a tree branch brushing against a window, I felt it all, and I hated that I did. It was as if something had shifted, something I couldn't name, but could feel pressing against the edges of my reality. I told myself, over and over again, that it was just an old film, an anomaly, some bizarre piece of forgotten cinema that had been sitting for too long in the dark, warping, deteriorating, creating strange images and patterns that only looked unnatural because my mind was already primed for fear. That had to be it. But then why couldn't I shake the feeling that something had followed me home? My apartment was a small, cluttered space on the third floor of an aging building, the kind with pipes that groaned at night, and floors that creaked even when no one was walking on them. Normally, it was comforting in its familiarity, but tonight, as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I felt no relief. The air was stale, the darkness inside seemed too deep, too dense. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out and flipping on the light. Nothing happened. I flicked the switch again, harder this time, as if force alone could will the bulbs to respond. Still nothing. The hallway outside remained lit, and I could hear the faint hum of a television from the neighbor's apartment, so it wasn't a power outage. It was just me. Just my apartment. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step inside, pushing the door shut behind me. My phone's flashlight cut through the darkness as I made my way to the kitchen, hands fumbling through a drawer until I found the small emergency flashlight I kept for situations like this. The beam wavered as I clicked it on, my grip unsteady. The apartment was empty. I knew it was. I had locked the door this morning, the windows were shut, and there was no sign of anything out of place. And yet I couldn't shake the sensation that I was not alone. I moved through the space carefully, my breath shallow, every muscle in my body tense. I checked the bedroom, the bathroom, even the cramped storage closet where I kept old film reels and forgotten belongings. Nothing. Just my own paranoia, amplifying every creak of the building, every shift of the shadows. I forced myself to take a deep breath, exhaling slowly, trying to ground myself. I was exhausted. That was all. The stress of the day, the strange film, the late hour, it had all taken its toll. I needed sleep. But just as I started toward the bedroom, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. The unmistakable whir of a film reel spinning. I froze, my pulse slamming against my ribs. The sound was faint, distant, but it was there, unmistakable in its steady rhythm. It was coming from the living room. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look. But I had to. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the source of the sound, the beam sweeping across the room until it landed on something that shouldn't have been there. The projector. My old, battered film projector, the one I kept in a box beneath my desk, was now sitting on my coffee table, its reels spinning lazily, though no film had been loaded onto it. The power cord dangled uselessly off the edge, unplugged. I took a step back, my mouth suddenly dry. I had left the archive with only the film canister, not the projector. There was no way I had brought it home with me. And yet, here it was, running as if it had been waiting for me. The flashlight flickered. For the briefest moment, in the instant before the light failed, I saw something move in the reflection of the dark television screen. A shape. A figure. Standing just behind me. The beam cut out completely, plunging the room into thick, suffocating darkness. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, my heartbeat an erratic drumbeat against my ribs. The only sound was the whispering click of the projector, still spinning, still running nothing. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the flashlight sputtered back to life. The projector had stopped. The room was empty. I was alone. But I knew, with every fiber of my being, that something had been there. And whatever it was no longer just inside the reel. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. That flicker of movement in the television screen, the brief glimpse of something standing behind me, watching. The rational part of my mind kept trying to explain it away, searching for any excuse that didn't involve the impossible. A trick of the light. My own shadow distorted by the beam of the flashlight. My exhausted brain conjuring up horrors where there were none. And yet none of those explanations held any weight when I looked at the projector, still sitting motionless on my coffee table. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even dared to get close. But it was there, as real as the floor beneath my feet, as undeniable as the cold sweat still clinging to my skin. At some point during the night, as the first pale hints of dawn crept in through my window, I convinced myself that I had to destroy the film. That was the only logical course of action. I had read about cursed objects before, stories passed around in horror forums, urban legends about paintings that burned themselves into people's minds, dolls that moved when no one was looking. Those stories always ended the same way. The object had to be destroyed before it destroyed the person who found it. It sounded ridiculous, even in my own head, but the alternative was worse. The metal canister sat on my desk, untouched since I had brought it home. I hadn't even realized I had brought it into my apartment until I saw it sitting there, its rusted surface catching the dim morning light. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the metal cool against my fingertips. It felt heavier than before, as if something inside had grown denser, more solid, pressing against the container walls. I took it into the kitchen, placing it on the countertop beside the sink. The thought of simply throwing it away had crossed my mind, but some instinct told me that wouldn't be enough. I had to be sure. I had to destroy it completely. I grabbed a pair of kitchen scissors, my fingers gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. It wouldn't be easy. The film was old, fragile, but resilient, wound tightly around its reel. But if I could cut it into enough pieces, if I could render it completely useless, maybe, just maybe, whatever was haunting it would die with it. I pried open the canister. The moment the lid came off, a thick, acrid scent filled the air. Something sour, like decaying leaves mixed with the metallic sting of burnt plastic. I gagged, covering my mouth with the sleeve of my shirt, my eyes watering. The film inside looked darker than before, the edges curling slightly as if resisting the light. I hesitated. The reel wasn't wound the way I had left it. I knew for certain that when I had last touched it, the film had been tightly wound, neatly arranged in its circular pattern. But now, strands of film trailed loosely around the reel, as if someone, or something, had handled it while I slept. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to move. I grabbed one of the loose strands, pulling it taut, raising the scissors. The blades hovered over the thin strip of film, and then the images flickered to life. Not on a screen, not through a projector. The moment the film was stretched between my hands, the pictures came alive, writhing and shifting like something organic. A face stared back at me, not mine. It was the man from the film, the one whose head had snapped back at that impossible angle. His eyes were black voids, his mouth frozen in a scream that I could not hear but could feel in my bones. His skin cracked and split, those dark veins crawling across his face like living things. And behind him, the shadows moved. There were others. Figures lurking just beyond the edges of the frame, shapes barely distinguishable from the darkness that surrounded them. They had no faces, only empty spaces where eyes should have been, their bodies stretched and distorted, as if the film itself struggled to contain them. And then, they turned toward me. The film ripped itself from my hands. It lashed against my skin like something alive, a whip of celluloid tightening around my wrist. I let out a strangled cry, jerking away, the scissors clattering to the floor as I stumbled backward. The reel spun violently, unspooling film at an unnatural speed, the loose strands slithering across the counter like grasping fingers. I scrambled to grab the scissors again, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears, but before I could reach them, the film suddenly went still. The images had stopped moving. The faces were frozen once more. The reel sat silent, unmoving, nothing but a tangled mess of old film stock strewn across my counter. For a long time, I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then, slowly, with a shaking hand, I reached for the scissors again. I had to finish this. I had to. A sound stopped me. Not the reel this time. Something else. A creak from the living room. My head snapped toward the sound, my entire body locking up. The flashlight was still on the coffee table where I had left it, its weak glow casting long, distorted shadows against the wall. My throat went dry. One of the shadows moved, not in the way light normally shifts, not in the way a shadow stretches when something passes in front of it. This one moved deliberately, purposefully, closer, and then I realized it wasn't cast by anything in the room. It was standing on its own, watching, waiting, and it had finally decided to step forward. I couldn't move. My body refused to respond, every muscle locked in place as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The shadow on the wall, tall and impossibly thin, had detached itself from the rest, its form shifting in unnatural ways, as if it were not confined to the limitations of flesh and bone. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, stretching across the floor, twisting and curling like smoke caught in an invisible current. I wanted to tell myself that it was just a trick of the light, that my exhaustion was making me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This thing was real. It was here. And it was watching me. A cold wave of dread washed over me, a primal kind of fear that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. My instincts screamed at me to run, to bolt for the door and never look back. But I was frozen in place, trapped in my own terror. The only sound in the room was the faint, uneven flickering of the flashlight, its weak beam doing little to push back the growing darkness. Then the shadow took another step forward. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel it moving, feel the air in the room shift, feel the suffocating weight of its presence pressing down on my chest. The G8 from the flashlight wavered, as if something unseen had passed between me and the beam. The temperature in the room dropped, an icy chill seeping into my skin, my breath turning shallow and ragged. And then I heard it. Not with my ears, but inside my head, a whisper, low and distorted, like a voice speaking from underwater, the words stretching and twisting into something almost recognizable, yet completely alien. It slithered through my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, pressing against my skull like cold fingers. Come closer. I gasped, stumbling backward, my shoulder colliding with the counter as my hands scrabbled for anything solid, anything real to ground myself. The shadow did not stop. It moved again, its elongated form stretching toward me, its featureless head tilting slightly, as if curious. The whisper came again, a sickly, hollow echo that sent a deep, aching dread through my bones. You brought us back. I shook my head violently, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to force the voice out of my head. But it was everywhere, surrounding me, burrowing deep beneath my skin. I could feel it, something ancient, something beyond comprehension, something that had been waiting. You watched. Now we watch. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, the darkness in the room thickened, swallowing the last traces of light. I couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The cold was unbearable now, sinking into my very core, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that if the light went out completely, if the shadows consumed everything, I wouldn't be here anymore. With a desperate, trembling hand, I grabbed the scissors from the floor. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I raised them high and brought them down on the film reel, the blades biting into the brittle strips of celluloid. The moment the scissors made contact, the shadow let out a sound. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a voice. It was something worse. A deep, guttural distortion, a sound that didn't belong in this world, something primal and raw that scraped against the inside of my skull like nails on metal. The air around me seemed to vibrate, the walls of my apartment stretching and warping as if reality itself were struggling to hold together. I forced the blades deeper, cutting, slashing, tearing the film apart in jagged, uneven strips. The images on the film flickered, the frozen faces twisting, their mouths opening in silent agony. The shadow on the wall convulsed, its form flickering, its shape distorting into something even less human. The whisper became a roar, 1,000 voices speaking at once, overlapping, screaming, laughing, sobbing, their words a tangled, incomprehensible mess. My head pounded, my vision blurred, but I kept cutting, kept destroying, my hands slick with sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, all at once, the sound stopped. The shadow froze, and the flashlight went out. I was plunged into absolute darkness. The The silence was unbearable, a crushing weight that pressed against my ears, my chest, my mind. For several long, agonizing seconds, I was certain that I had failed, that the thing in the shadows had won, that I was no longer in my apartment, no longer anywhere at all. Then, a faint glow. The flashlight sputtered weakly back to life, its beam casting a pale, flickering light across the ruined film. The shadow was gone. The whisper was gone. The apartment was still. I dropped the scissors, my entire body trembling, my breath coming in broken gasps. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor, my back pressed against the cabinets as I tried to process what had just happened. The film reel lay in ruins, torn apart, its pieces scattered across the counter and floor like the remains of something dead. The air still carried that acrid, metallic scent, but the oppressive, suffocating presence was gone. For the first time since I had watched that cursed footage, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't sleep. I didn't move from that spot until the sun had fully risen, filling the apartment with warm, golden light. Even then, I barely had the strength to stand. But it was over. It had to be over. I had destroyed the film. I had cut it apart with my own hands. Whatever nightmare had been tied to that cursed reel, whatever horror had seeped out of its images, it was gone now. At least, that's what I told myself. But somewhere, deep in the pit of my stomach, a cold, gnawing fear remained. Because as I sat there, staring at the scattered remains of the film, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting. I spent the rest of the morning in a daze, my limbs heavy, my mind sluggish, as though I had been running for miles without stopping. The sunlight streaming through the window should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. Nothing did. My apartment star Siegen. Elle carried the weight of the night before, the air thick with something unseen, something I could not name but could feel in the marrow of my bones. The pieces of the film reel remained where they had fallen, torn strips of celluloid scattered across my kitchen counter and floor, their jagged edges catching the morning light like broken glass. I couldn't bring myself to touch them. For hours I sat in silence, unable to move, unable to convince myself that it was truly over. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow again, shifting and stretching, its faceless form standing just at the edge of the light. I heard the whisper, crawling through my mind like a sickness, speaking in that distorted, inhuman voice. You watched. Now we watch. The words repeated over and over, an echo that would not fade, a truth I did not want to believe. But I had destroyed the film. I had torn it apart with my own hands, severed its connection to whatever nightmare had been lurking within its frames. I told myself that over and over again, trying to make it real, trying to force myself to believe that I had won. And yet, somewhere deep inside me, I knew. The thing in the film had never needed the real to exist. I left the apartment around noon, stepping outside for the first time in what felt like years, the city streets too bright, too loud, the normalcy of it jarring against the chaos in my mind. People passed me by without a second glance, their lives continuing uninterrupted, oblivious to the horror that had unraveled in my home, in my mind. The world had not changed. Only I had. I walked without direction, my thoughts tangled, my nerves frayed, until I found myself outside the university archives. My stomach twisted. The idea of stepping back inside that room made my skin crawl, but I had to be sure. I had to see it one last time. If the projector was still running, if the reel had somehow reappeared, if the whisper was still waiting for me in the silence, I needed to know. The building was empty when I arrived, the air stale, thick with the scent of paper and dust. I moved through the halls like a ghost, my footsteps too loud in the quiet, my breath shallow as I reached the basement door. My fingers hovered over the handle, my body screaming at me to turn around, to leave, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But I had never been able to let things go. That was my flaw. I needed answers, no matter what they cost. The door creaked open. The archive room was exactly as I had left it. Dim, cold, the rows of film reels lined up like tombstones. The projector sat in the center of the room, silent, still. The film reel was gone. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding, my knees nearly giving out beneath me. It was over. It had to be over. But then, the bulb in the projector flickered. The machine shuddered, the reels beginning to spin, though no film had been loaded. My breath caught in my throat as the screen flickered to life, static crackling across its surface before an image began to form. I didn't want to look. I couldn't look. But my eyes were drawn to it, my body frozen in place as the image sharpened, the grainy black and white footage slowly coming into focus. It was my apartment, my living room. The coffee table, the couch, the broken pieces of the film reel still scattered across the floor. And then I saw myself. I was standing there in the footage, my back to the camera, my posture stiff, unmoving. My breath came in short gasps, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The version of me on the screen slowly turned, his face still obscured by the grainy distortion of the film, but I could feel his gaze locking onto mine. Then he smiled. Not a normal smile, not something human. His lips stretched too wide, his teeth too sharp, the expression one of mockery, of hunger. The whisper came again, curling through the air like smoke, threading itself into my mind. You watched. Now we watch. The figure on the screen took a step forward, and the lights in the room went out. Darkness swallowed me whole, the temperature in the archive plummeting, the air thick and suffocating. My body locked up, my breath frozen in my throat as I felt something shift in the shadows behind me. The whisper grew louder, rising to a chorus of voices, overlapping, breaking, twisting into something beyond sound, beyond language. My own voice joined them, screaming, my body no longer my own, my mind unraveling as something reached for me from the depths of the dark. And then, silence. When the lights flickered back on, the room was empty. The projector was still spinning, the film playing, the footage continuing without pause. The image on the screen had changed. The archive room was gone. Now it showed a different scene, a new location, a new person, a man I recognized, my colleague. He was sitting, in his office, his back to the camera, unaware that he was being watched. And then, slowly, in that same unnatural, stomach-turning way, he began to turn. His expression twisted in confusion, then fear. His mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. The whisper returned, its voice stretching across the silence like something ancient, something endless. You watched. Now he watches. And in that moment, I understood. The film could not be destroyed. It would never die. It would find another, and another, and another. The reel kept spinning. The footage kept playing. The whisper never stopped. The film had already chosen its next viewer. It started with an ad. Keeper wanted. Isolated lighthouse. full room and board. Must be comfortable working alone. That was it. No long explanations, no warnings, just a few words buried in the back pages of an old newspaper. It felt like a joke, almost like a dare. But I needed the job. I had just left a life that no longer fit. An apartment that smelled like mold, a relationship I had already mourned, a city that had swallowed me whole. The idea of solitude, of the steady rhythm of waves and wind, felt like an escape. I told myself it would be peaceful. I told myself I could handle it. I was wrong. The island was smaller than I expected. Just a sliver of rock, barely enough space for the lighthouse, and a narrow strip of land leading to the docks. When the supply boat dropped me off, the captain barely spoke to me. Just a nod, a muttered, "Good luck." And then he was gone, the boat vanishing into the mist. I stood there, alone, the air thick with salt, and something else, something stale, like old wood left too long in the damp. The lighthouse loomed above me, its white paint peeling, its black lantern room staring down like a watchful eye. Inside, everything was as I had expected. Sparse. A small cot, a stove, a desk. And on the desk, a single book. The previous keeper's diary. I almost didn't open it. It felt personal, but curiosity won. The first few pages were normal. Weather updates, supply lists, notes about the generator. But as I flipped further, the entries changed. The light flickered again last night. I checked the wiring, but nothing's wrong. I feel like something's watching me. I closed the book. I wasn't superstitious. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But there was something about those words, something in the way they were written, hurried, desperate, that made my skin prickle. That night, I lay in my cot, listening. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The waves pounded the rocks below. And then, something else. A creak. Footsteps. Not mine. Slow, deliberate, coming from the spiral staircase leading up to the lantern room. I held my breath. It's just the wind, I told myself. The old building settling. But I didn't sleep. And in the morning, when I went to check the lantern room, the door was open. I knew I had locked it. I should have left then. But I didn't. The door to the lantern room hung open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze, the rusted hinges groaning as if protesting my arrival. I stood at the base of the spiral staircase, staring up into the dim light filtering down from above. My breath caught somewhere between disbelief and a quiet, creeping fear I refused to acknowledge. I had locked that door. I was sure of it. The key had been in my pocket, and I had turned the lock myself before going to bed. I wanted to believe there was some simple explanation. Maybe the latch was faulty. Maybe the wind had forced it open. But deep down, something in me knew that wasn't true. Slowly, cautiously, I climbed the stairs, each step ringing out against the silence, my heartbeat loud in my ears. The air grew colder as I ascended, the salt in the wind sharper, the smell of oil from the lamp thick and cloying. When I reached the top, I hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. The lantern room was empty. Everything was as it should be. The massive Fresnel lens stood in its metal frame, the glass reflecting shards of daylight, the control panel humming softly, the logbook resting exactly where the previous keeper must have left it. Nothing looked disturbed, and yet the air felt heavy, thick with something unseen, something watching. I forced myself to move, checking the locks, inspecting the windows, running my hands over the doorframe as if searching for proof of what I already knew. The lock wasn't broken. There were no signs of forced entry. There was no logical reason for that door to have opened on its own. But it had. I exhaled slowly, shaking off the tension in my shoulders, forcing myself to focus. I was alone here. That was the deal I had signed up for, the reality I had chosen. My mind was playing tricks on me, finding patterns where there were none, turning the normal groans of an aging lighthouse into something sinister. Still, when I left the lantern room, I made sure to turn the key twice, testing the door handle before making my way back down. The day passed in a restless haze, my thoughts circling back to the diary, to the words scrawled in uneven handwriting across its yellowed pages. I told myself I wouldn't read more, that I wouldn't let my imagination feed on the paranoia of someone who had lived here before me. But by nightfall, as the sky darkened and the wind howled through the cracks in the old stone walls, I found myself sitting at the desk, my fingers tracing the edges of the worn leather cover, unable to resist. I turned the page. I hear them at night, the footsteps. They come from the tower, moving down the stairs, stopping just outside my door, but when I open it, there's nothing there. I swallowed, the words settling into my chest like a weight. The previous keeper had heard them too. I almost shut the book, almost walked away, but my eyes kept moving, scanning the page, drawn forward by a mix of dread and fascination I couldn't shake. They know I can hear them. A gust of wind slammed against the lighthouse, rattling the glass panes in the windows, but I barely flinched. My pulse was a steady drumbeat in my ears, my skin cold despite the warmth of the small stove crackling in the corner. I wasn't scared. At least, that's what I told myself. I left the diary open on the desk, the pages curling slightly in the damp air, and made my way to bed, determined to push the unease from my mind. But as I lay there, wrapped in the thick silence of the island, the words echoed in my head. I hear them at night. The footsteps, a floorboard creaked outside my room. I stopped breathing. The sound was slow, deliberate, the weight of it unmistakable. Someone, something, was standing just beyond my door. I wanted to tell myself it was just the old wood settling, just the wind shifting through the cracks in the stone. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps weren't random. They were steady, rhythmic, too careful to be anything but intentional. I turned onto my side, staring at the thin sliver of space beneath the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The shadows flickered, stretching and shifting as the lighthouse beam passed over them, but there was no movement. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick with expectation, with something waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my face into the pillow, willing myself to breathe evenly, to pretend I hadn't heard anything at all. Minutes passed, then hours. Somehow I must have fallen asleep. Because when I woke, the door was open and the diary was gone. I sat up too quickly, the abrupt movement making my head spin, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the empty desk. The diary was gone. The weight of that realization pressed down on me, thick and suffocating, my body frozen in place as my mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe I had moved it in my sleep, carried it somewhere without remembering, some half-conscious action in the haze of exhaustion. That had to be it. I had been tired, unsettled, distracted by the storm and the words on the page. Maybe I had tucked it under my pillow without thinking, or placed it on the shelf where the logs and maintenance records sat collecting dust. But I already knew, deep down, that none of that was true. The door. That was what my eyes kept returning to. The door that had been closed when I lay down. the door that now stood open just an inch, just wide enough for a sliver of pale morning light to creep across the floor. My stomach twisted, the kind of slow, sinking dread that comes when you know something is wrong but can't yet bring yourself to name it. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor, the old boards creaking beneath my weight as I forced myself to stand. The air in the room felt different now, heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. The wind outside had died down to a low, whispering moan, and for the first time since arriving, I was acutely aware of just how alone I was. I took a step forward, then another. I told myself I would find the diary, that it had to be somewhere logical, that I would laugh about this later when the daylight had fully settled in, and the irrational fear of the night had loosened its grip on my thoughts. But as I stepped into the main room of the lighthouse, I stopped. The diary was sitting in the middle of the floor. Open? The pages fluttered slightly in the breeze, seeping through the cracks in the window pane, the soft rustling filling the silence in a way that made my skin prickle. I stared at it, every instinct in my body screaming at me not to move closer, not to touch it, to turn around and leave it where it was. But my feet betrayed me, carrying me forward, my breath shallow, my hands clammy as I knelt down beside it. The ink on the open page was darker, fresher, as if the words had been written only moments ago. And as my eyes scanned the lines, my stomach clenched. I hadn't read this entry before. It hadn't been there last night. The handwriting was the same, erratic, rushed, the same frantic slant as the other entries, but the words were new. I am not alone. I recoiled, the breath leaving my lungs in a sharp exhale, my pulse hammering so loudly in my ears that for a moment I couldn't hear or anything else. My fingers trembled as I reached out, brushing against the edge of the paper, the feeling of the rough, aged pages grounding me just enough to keep me from panicking completely. I forced myself to turn the page, and my blood ran cold. The words were there again. I am not alone. Page after page, the same phrase repeating itself, the ink growing darker, heavier, the strokes uneven as if written by a shaking hand. Some letters smudged, some dug so deeply into the paper that they nearly tore through. The message was insistent, desperate, as if whoever had written it had needed me to understand, had wanted to make sure I wouldn't ignore it. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my hands tightening around the edges of the diary as I flipped forward. The last page stopped me cold. My breath hitched. Because the handwriting had changed. It was still hurried, still jagged with urgency, but the letters were different now. The slant, the shape of the strokes. It wasn't the same erratic scrawl I had seen before. It was mine. The ink was fresh. My own handwriting, unmistakable, the letters forming the words over and over again, filling the page. I am not alone. I shoved the diary away from me, scrambling back so quickly that I nearly knocked over the chair behind me, my heart pounding so hard it made my ribs ache. This wasn't possible. I hadn't written this. I hadn't touched the diary since last night. I hadn't picked up a pen. I hadn't... A sound. Behind me. The unmistakable creak of a floorboard shifting beneath weight. The kind of sound that couldn't be blamed on the wind or the settling of an old building. Slow, deliberate, just like before. I turned. The room was empty, but the air was colder now, and the lighthouse door, the heavy iron door leading to the outside, was open, wide open. Beyond it, the island stretched out beneath the gray sky, the sea restless against the jagged rocks, the wind whispering through the grass in a voice that almost sounded like words. I was not alone. I know that now. And whatever was here with me, it wanted me to know it too. The lighthouse door gaped open, its heavy iron frame swaying ever so slightly in the wind, the hinges groaning like something old and wounded. I stared at it, my breath shallow, my pulse a slow, dull throb in my ears. It had been locked. I had locked it. There was no question in my mind. And yet, here it was, swinging open as if something, had unlatched it from the inside and stepped out into the cold, waiting dark. For a long moment, I didn't move. I couldn't. My body had turned rigid, my limbs locked in place as if they no longer belonged to me, as if they understood something my mind refused to accept. The wind rushed in through the open doorway, curling around my ankles, carrying the damp, briny scent of the sea, a smell that now made my stomach twist with unease rather than comfort. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. Not inside the lighthouse this time, not circling the spiral staircase or shifting just beyond my door. They were outside, moving along the rocky path that led from the tower to the water's edge. Slow, measured, as if they knew I was listening. I forced myself to step forward, my bare feet meeting the cold stone floor, my skin prickling with a deep, instinctive warning that this was not something I should chase, not something I should acknowledge. But I had to. I had to know. I reached the doorway and peered out. The sky had darkened with thick clouds, heavy with the threat of rain, the sea churning in restless swells. The island was as empty as it had been the day I arrived, just a stretch of jagged rock surrounded by endless, unbroken water. There was no movement, no sign of life. But the footprints were there, fresh, trailing away from the lighthouse, pressed deep into the damp earth, leading toward the edge of the cliff, where the land broke away into nothingness. I stared at them, my mind grasping for some kind of explanation, some kind of logic that could make sense of what I was seeing. But there was none. The prints were deep, too deep, as if whatever had left them was impossibly heavy, as if it had sunk into the ground with each step. And then I saw it. At the very edge of the island, where the footprints ended abruptly, where there was nothing but air beyond the last step. A figure, standing perfectly still, facing the sea. The wind tore at its outline, the mist curling around it, but it didn't move. It didn't shift or sway or react to the storm that was gathering just beyond the horizon. It was just there, watching. I opened my mouth, some half-formed question on the tip of my tongue, some useless demand for answers that I already knew would never come. But before I could speak, before I could even take a step closer, it turned. I didn't see its face. I don't know if it had a face. What I saw instead was a void, a hollow absence where features should have been, a shape carved from darkness itself. And yet I felt it looking at me, felt its gaze settle deep into my bones, into the spaces between my thoughts, curling there like something living, something waiting. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, my pulse hammering wildly as I turned and bolted toward the lighthouse, my feet slipping against the damp stone, my hands scrambling for the door. I shoved it closed, the heavy iron slamming into place, my fingers fumbling to lock it, to secure myself inside, even though I knew, somehow, that it wouldn't matter. I pressed my back against the door, my chest heaving, my skin damp with sweat despite the chill. The silence in the lighthouse stretched long and empty around me, the air thick with something unseen, something shifting in the dark corners where the lantern's glow couldn't reach. And then, the lantern flickered, just for a second. The beam of light that had been sweeping across the water shuddered, dimming as if something had passed in front of it, something massive, something that should not have been there. I forced myself to move, to climb the stairs 2 at a time, my legs aching, my breath ragged. When I reached the lantern room, I threw open the door, stepping inside just in time to see the light stutter once more, the glass reflecting something, something behind me, something standing too close, too near. But when I spun around, the room was empty. I was alone, and yet in the reflection of the glass, I could still see it, a shadow, looming just beyond my own, moving when I did not. I stood frozen in the lantern room, my own breath too loud in the silence, my pulse hammering as I stared at the glass reflection before me. The shadow behind me was wrong. It didn't match my movements. It didn't shift when I did. It loomed, stretching taller, darker, its edges flickering like a flame that had learned to breathe. I turned sharply, my hands gripping the railing, my whole body braced for something, anything. But the room was empty. Just the great, glass-encased light in the center, turning steadily, sending its beacon out into the night, cutting through the mist in slow, steady intervals. But I knew, deep down, in the place that logic couldn't reach, that I wasn't alone. The diary had said it. I had written it. I am not alone. The thought sent a violent shiver through me, and I stepped back, the old wood beneath my feet groaning. I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave the lantern room, to go back downstairs, to lock myself in my quarters until morning. But the moment I turned toward the spiral stairs, something changed. The light flickered again, but this time it didn't come back on. Darkness swallowed the room in an instant, thick and absolute, like ink spilling across the world, like something alive pressing against me from all sides. The air turned sharp with the smell of burning oil, the scent so strong it made my throat tighten, my stomach turn. I reached out blindly, my fingers scraping against metal as I stumbled forward, desperate to find the railing, the stairs, anything that could lead me back down. And then, in the silence, the whisper came. Right behind me. Close enough that I should have felt breath against my skin. But there was nothing. Just the voice, thin and dry, like wind through dead grass. You kept the light on. I spun, nearly slipping on the slick floor, my body colliding with the glass casing of the lantern. My pulse pounded against my ribs, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I tried to see through the darkness. But there was nothing. No figure. No movement. Just the heavy weight of something unseen. Something watching. Something waiting. The voice came again, softer this time, curling around me like smoke. But I was in the dark. A hand, cold, damp, not quite solid, brushed against my arm. I screamed. My hands found the railing, and I ran, stumbling down the spiral staircase, my feet barely catching the steps, my shoulder slamming against the stone wall as I spiraled lower and lower, away from whatever had been up there with me. The darkness stretched, too thick, too deep, swallowing the narrow beams of moonlight filtering in through the windows. My mind screamed for logic, for reason, but there was none. The lighthouse was failing. The lantern was out. The one thing that was supposed to stay lit. I reached the bottom floor, nearly collapsing against the door to my quarters, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the lock, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it, bracing my back against the wood. The air in the room was damp, heavy, the scent of salt and decay pressing in. And then I saw Tuon, the diary. It was open again, resting in the center of the floor. But the words were gone. Every page was blank. My hands trembled as I reached for it, flipping through the pages, my breath hitching in my throat, the frantic scribbles, the warnings, the desperate confessions of the previous keeper. All of it was gone, as if the book had never been written in the first place, as if it had been waiting for something else, waiting for me. And then, the final page. My breath caught. Because there, written in my own handwriting, in ink still wet and gleaming beneath the dim light, "You let the light go out." A low creak came from the hallway outside my door. The footsteps had returned, slow, deliberate, stopping just outside. I pressed a hand over my mouth, my body shaking, my mind scrambling for something, anything that made sense. But there was nothing left to make sense of. I had taken this job because I had wanted solitude, because I had wanted to escape. But I hadn't been alone. Not for a single moment. I had kept the light on. But now, the darkness had come. A soft, slow knock echoed against the wood behind me. I squeezed my eyes shut. Another knock, and then the handle turned. I woke up on the beach. The sky above me was pale, the first hints of dawn stretching thin against the horizon. The waves lapped gently at the shore, the tide whispering against the rocks, the world silent except for the distant call of gulls. I sat up, my head throbbing, my limbs stiff with cold. My clothes were damp, covered in salt and sand, my fingers curling into the wet earth as I tried to ground myself, to piece together what had happened. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its towering shape sharp against the gray sky. The lantern room was dark. No light shone from within. The air was still. Too still. And then, as I slowly pulled myself to my feet, as I turned my gaze downward, I saw it. The diary, resting in the sand beside me. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for it, my fingers hesitant, my pulse thrumming with something between fear and inevitability. The leather was cold beneath my touch, the pages stiff with dried salt. I didn't want to open it, but I did. And there, filling the pages, covering every inch of paper, written in my own handwriting, I am not alone. The wind stirred, whispering against my skin, and as I looked up toward the lighthouse, toward the darkened lantern room at its peak, the light flickered. On, off, signaling to no one. I was lying on a wooden bench in the middle of a small town square. The kind of town you drive through without a second thought. Brick buildings with faded paint, a general store with a rusted sign swinging in the non-existent wind, and a church with a steeple stabbing into a gray, cloud-covered sky. It wasn't a place I recognized. My throat was dry, my limbs stiff. How did I get here? I scanned my surroundings, expecting someone, anyone, to be walking around. A shopkeeper, a kid on a bike, an old man sweeping his porch. But there was nothing. Not even the sound of my own breath for a moment. It was as if the world had taken a step back and left me behind. I stood up, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the cracked pavement. "Hello?" I called out. My voice felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. It got swallowed up too quickly, like something unseen had been waiting to smother it. Then I heard it. A whisper. Faint. Soft. Just behind me. I turned fast, but no one was there. Just an empty street, the windows of the buildings dark. The feeling of being watched curled around my spine like cold fingers. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I walked toward the nearest building, a diner with its name rubbed away by time. The door was unlocked, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, everything was frozen in place. Half-eaten meals sat on the tables, coffee cups still full. A newspaper lay open at the counter. October 12th, 1997. That couldn't be right. That was decades ago. Another whisper. Closer. My skin prickled. I turned sharply toward the source, but again, nothing. The diner was empty. But I could feel someone watching me, just out of sight, just beyond where my eyes could reach. I stumbled back outside, my pulse hammering. I needed to find someone. Anyone. I ran down the street, past the abandoned general store, past the eerily silent barber shop, past houses with open doors and empty chairs on the porch. It was like everyone had simply stood up and vanished in the middle of their lives. The road out of town stretched before me, disappearing into thick trees. I didn't care where it led. I just needed to leave. I ran. But after what felt like forever, I found myself right back where I started. The town square. The same wooden bench. The same silent buildings. That wasn't possible. I turned and ran down a different road, forcing myself not to look at the dark windows lining the street. But no matter which road I took, I always ended up back at the square. My breath came in ragged gasps now. My head pounded. I wasn't supposed to be here, and yet I couldn't leave. Then I saw them. Dark figures, standing in the windows of the buildings, watching, silent. Their outlines were blurred, like shadows cast by nothing. No eyes, no faces, just the sense of being seen. My mouth went dry, my feet frozen to the pavement. Another whisper, this time right next to my ear. Stay. I spun around, my heartbeat a thunder in my chest. Nothing. But when I turned back, the figures in the windows were gone. The silence wrapped around me, thicker than before. And I knew, in that moment, that I wasn't leaving this place. Not yet. I don't know how long I stood there in the middle of that empty town square, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my body refusing to move. The silence pressed against my ears, heavy and unnatural, making me feel like I was buried beneath something unseen. The figures in the windows were gone, but the sensation of being watched hadn't left. It had only grown stronger, thickening in the air like an unseen fog curling around my limbs. I turned slowly, scanning every darkened window, every open doorway, every alley where the shadows pooled too deeply. There was no movement, but that didn't mean I was alone. I could still feel them, just beyond my vision, just out of reach. I forced my legs to move, one foot in front of the other, stepping cautiously across the cracked pavement. I needed answers. I needed to understand where I was, why the town was empty, why the roads wouldn't let me leave. My first thought was to check the buildings, even though my skin crawled at the idea of stepping inside them, of moving deeper into whatever strange and invisible force was at work here. I walked toward the general store first, drawn to its broken sign swaying in the still air. The wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound almost deafening in the overwhelming quiet. Inside, the store was just as frozen in time as the diner had been. Shelves stocked with canned goods covered in a thin layer of dust. A cash register left open, a few crumpled bills and rusted coins inside. A shopping cart abandoned in the middle of the aisle, filled with boxes of cereal and a carton of milk that had long since curdled into a solid lump. I stepped deeper inside, feeling the air grow colder the further I went. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been here in years. And yet the feeling of being watched never wavered. If anything, it grew sharper, a needle pressing into my spine, making the hair on my arms rise. Then I heard it again, the whisper, soft, distant, coming from the back of the store. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move toward the sound, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run. The back of the store was darker, the lights flickering weakly overhead. A door stood slightly ajar, leading into what looked like a storage room. The whisper came again, low and hushed, like someone was speaking just beneath their breath. I reached out with a shaking hand, pushing the door open further. The storage room was small, lined with metal shelves stacked high with boxes. A single bulb swung from the ceiling, casting shifting shadows against the walls. But it wasn't the room that made my stomach drop. It was what was on the floor. A radio. Old. Beaten. Covered in dust. And it was turned on. Static crackled from the speaker, a low hum that barely rose above the sound of my own heartbeat. But buried beneath the static was something else. A voice. Too faint to make out the words, but unmistakably there. I crouched down, my fingers hovering over the dial. The moment I touched it, the static shifted, the voice growing clearer. It was whispering something over and over again, the same words, repeating like a broken record. You left them. You left them. You left them. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers went numb. I yanked my hand back as if burned, the radio's whisper digging into my skull, into my bones, into something deeper than memory. The words made no sense, and yet they did. A part of me understood them in a way I couldn't explain, couldn't accept. I stumbled backward, knocking into the shelves, sending a can tumbling to the floor with a metallic clang. The moment the sound echoed through the storage room, the radio cut off. Silence. Then, the light flickered. A shadow moved in the corner of my eye. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. The storage room was empty. But I knew something had been there. Standing just behind me, close enough to reach out, close enough to touch. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of their presence had not. I could feel them pressing against the edges of my vision, just out of sight, just beyond the threshold of understanding. I ran. Out of the storage room, out of the general store, back into the empty streets that felt far less empty than before. The moment I stepped outside, the sky had darkened. The clouds hung lower, thicker, as if the town was being swallowed by the weight of something unseen. The buildings seemed taller, the windows darker, the doorways like open mouths waiting to pull me in. And then I saw them again. The figures in the windows, every building, every floor, watching, waiting. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, my body locked in place by the sheer wrongness of it all. The figures weren't just watching anymore. They were closer. Not in the windows, but just inside the doorways now, just beneath the awnings, just behind the glass. The town was not empty. It had never been empty. I was not alone, and they were waiting for me to understand why. I don't know how long I stood there in the middle of that empty street, my breath shallow, my hands shaking at my sides, my mind trying and failing to process what I was seeing. The figures in the windows weren't moving, weren't making a sound, weren't giving me any indication that they were even real. And yet I knew, deep down in the part of me that understood fear before logic, that they were watching me. I could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on me, heavier than the silence, heavier than the air itself. The longer I looked, the more I became convinced that they weren't just standing there, that their presence was not passive, that they were waiting for something. Waiting for me to move, waiting for me to react, waiting for me to step in the wrong direction or breathe at the wrong moment. A terrible thought crept into my mind, uninvited and unwelcome. If I turned my back, would they come closer? My skin prickled with the kind of cold that had nothing to do with the air. I forced myself to step backward, my eyes never leaving them, my body screaming at me to run, but my instincts knowing better. Running didn't work in this town. I had tried. The roads looped back on themselves, the buildings stood unchanging, the town square remained the heart of this strange, suffocating trap. I needed another way out. Forcing my gaze away from the figures, I turned sharply and strode toward the church at the end of the street, its pointed steeple looming against the darkening sea. Kai, its wooden doors shut tight. My steps echoed unnaturally loud against the pavement, as if the town itself wanted to make sure I heard my own movements, as if something unseen wanted me to be aware of every inch I traveled. The moment my hands pressed against the church doors, a sound cut through the silence. A creak. Not from me. From behind me. I turned just enough to see that one of the doors in the nearest building had shifted, cracked open ever so slightly. The figure that had been standing just inside was no longer there. The darkness beyond the doorway yawned wide, empty and endless, and for the first time, I wished I could still see the shadow standing there, because now I didn't know where it had gone. Swallowing hard, I shoved at the church doors, expecting resistance, expecting them to be locked like some cruel joke, but they gave way easily, swinging inward with a slow, groaning moan that set my nerves on edge. I stepped inside without hesitation, letting the doors fall shut behind me, sealing me in with whatever secrets the church held. Inside, the air was heavier, thicker, the scent of dust and old wood filling my lungs with every breath. The pews stretched out in perfect rows, untouched by time. The altar standing silent at the far end beneath a massive stained glass window that should have cast colors across the floor, but didn't. The light outside was too dim, the sky too smothered in gray, leaving everything inside bathed in a muted, lifeless glow. And then I saw them. The photographs. They covered the walls, hundreds of them, maybe more, each one framed in simple wood, each one containing a face staring directly outward. Men, women, children, old and young, all captured in black and white stillness, their expressions frozen in time. But something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Their eyes. Every single one had their eyes scratched out. Deep, jagged marks ran across each photograph, gouged into the images as if someone had taken a blade and torn away the most human part of them. The longer I looked, the more unsettled I became, because the faces were familiar, not because I knew them personally, but because I had seen them. In the diner, in the general store, on the porches of the empty houses. These were the missing people of the town. My stomach twisted with the kind of dread that doesn't sit on the surface, but burrows deep, embedding itself into your bones. My fingers itched to reach out, to touch one of the photographs, to confirm that what I was seeing was real, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, my eyes were drawn to something else. A single frame set apart from the others, positioned directly in front of the altar. It was larger, its placement deliberate, its presence commanding attention. And it was empty. No photograph, no scratched-out eyes. Just a blank space where a face should have been. A cold realization settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake. Whoever had done this, whoever had erased these people, had left a space for one more. For me. A whisper curled through the air, barely audible, just a breath against the silence. But it was enough to send ice crawling down my spine. Not from behind me, not from the corners of the church, from the empty frame. A whisper, rising just enough for me to hear. You left them. The words from the radio, the same accusation. A deep, shuddering breath left my lips, my mind racing, trying to understand, trying to piece together something that refused to fit. I didn't know this town. I didn't know these people. But the way the words were spoken, the way they settled in my chest like an unshakable truth, made me wonder if I had simply forgotten. A soft creak broke through my spiraling thoughts. The church doors, opening, slowly. I turned just in time to see the dark figures stepping inside, their faceless forms no longer confined to windows and doorways. They were here now, inside with me, standing between the pews, between the wooden benches, closer than ever before. The whisper came again, not from the empty frame this time, but from all around me, overlapping voices merging into one. You left them. I wanted to scream that I didn't understand, that I didn't know what they wanted, that I wasn't who they thought I was. But the words wouldn't come, because a part of me knew they wouldn't believe me. And a deeper part of me wasn't sure I believed it either. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figures stood in the dim light of the church, motionless, soundless, just dark silhouettes against the pale wood of the pews. There were so many of them now, more than I had seen before, their shapes shifting slightly as if they weren't entirely solid, as if they existed just on the edge of reality, slipping between the world I understood and something much worse. The whispering didn't stop, but it grew, layer upon layer, voices overlapping, some slow and deliberate, others frantic, almost pleading. The same words, over and over, blending together into a sickening chorus that filled every inch of the church, pressing against my skull until I thought my head might split apart. You left them, you left them, you left them. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. I took a step back, my heel scraping against the old wooden floor, the sound sharp and wrong in the dense, suffocating air. The figures didn't move, didn't react, but I knew they were waiting, watching. I turned sharply toward the empty frame on the wall, the one set apart from all the others, the one that had no face, no eyes to be scratched out. My mind fought against the obvious truth, but it was there, unavoidable, written into every detail of this place. That frame was meant for me. I was supposed to be part of this town, part of whatever had happened here, part of whatever was still happening. I shook my head, forcing myself to swallow the rising panic. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I had no memory of this place, no connection to these people. The accusations in their whispers meant nothing. They were wrong. They had to be wrong. But then why did the words make my stomach twist with something uncomfortably close to guilt? Another step back, another scrape of my shoe against the wood. The figures shifted this time, a slow, barely perceptible movement, like shadows cast by a flickering flame. The nearest one stood at the end of a pew, its shape almost human, but not quite, its edges blurred, its form stretching and warping as if it couldn't quite hold itself together. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out anything distinct, but somehow I knew it was looking at me. The whispers changed. One voice, separate from the rest, rose above the others. Do you remember now? I opened my mouth to answer, but my throat was dry, my voice stolen by the thick, pressing silence that followed the question. Did I remember? No. That was the truth. I had never been here before. I had never seen this place, never seen these people. And yet, a deeper part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, wasn't so sure. The moment stretched, long and unbearable, and then the whispers returned. Louder this time, closer, circling me like unseen hands reaching for my skin. You left them. You left them. You left them. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just ran, shoving past the pews, my feet pounding against the floor as I lunged for the open church doors. The figures didn't chase me, didn't move, but I could feel them, could feel their presence pressing against my back, pushing me forward as if they wanted me to leave, as if they needed me to see something else. The moment I stepped outside, the air felt different, heavier. The sky had darkened even more, the clouds thick and unmoving, the entire town cast in deep, endless shadow. The buildings stood taller now, their windows gaping like open mouths, their doors ajar, waiting. The town square no longer looked the same. The bench where I had first woken up was gone. The road stretched in new directions, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense, leading deeper into places that shouldn't exist. And then I heard it. Not whispers this time. A voice. Clear. Steady. Familiar. My own. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. Across the street, standing just beyond the old general store, was a figure that wasn't like the others. It wasn't just a shadow, wasn't just a shape. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The same face, the same clothes, the same wide, terrified eyes staring back at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not fear, not confusion. Something else. Something worse. Recognition. The figure, my double, took a slow step forward, and then another. The town around us seemed to shift, the buildings groaning as if they were alive, the air thickening, the silence breaking with a deep, distant sound that I could only describe as something waking up. My own voice, coming from the figure in front of me, spoke again, calm and quiet, but carrying something heavy beneath the surface. You left them, it said, and now they won't let you leave. I shook my head, stepping back, my body trembling, my mind fighting to make sense of what was happening. The whispers had never stopped, still murmuring from the doorways, from the alleys, from the very walls of the town itself. You left them. You left them. You left them. And now I was starting to wonder if they were right. I couldn't move. The figure that looked like me stood across the street, its gaze locked onto mine, its expression unreadable, its presence impossible. My mind rejected it, tried to reason with it, but there was no logic here, no explanation that made sense. This town twisted reality, bent time, blurred the lines between what was real and what wasn't. And yet the figure wasn't like the others. It wasn't a shadow lurking behind a window, wasn't a whisper curling through the air. It was solid, tangible. It was me. You left them, it repeated, its voice steady, measured, carrying the weight of something undeniable. And now they won't let you leave. I took a step back, my body instinctively recoiling, but the figure stepped forward in perfect sync, mirroring me, closing the distance with deliberate slowness. It didn't lunge, didn't rush toward me, didn't act with the mindless aggression I had come to expect from nightmares. That was what made it worse. It was patient. It had time. And so did they. The whispers hadn't stopped. They surrounded me, pressing in from all sides, voices slipping through the cracks of the town, filling the spaces between my thoughts, dragging something buried deep inside me to the surface. I had spent so much time denying it, rejecting the words, convincing myself that I was a victim in all this, that I had been thrown into this nightmare without cause. But what if that wasn't true? I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my skin cold, my pulse hammering unevenly in my chest. I forced my lips to move, my voice coming out hoarse and strained, like it barely belonged to me anymore. "I don't know what you mean," I said, and the words felt thin, weak, empty. The figure tilted its head slightly, not in confusion, not in frustration, but as if it was waiting for me to catch up, waiting for me to admit what it already knew. "You don't remember," it said, softer this time, almost sympathetic. "But you will." And then it raised its hand. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it wanted to make sure I saw exactly what it was doing. Its fingers curled, gripping the edge of its own face, nails digging into the skin just beneath the eyes, and then it pulled. I sucked in a sharp breath as the skin peeled away, as its face split like old paper, the flesh tearing, the sound a wet, sickening rip that sent a jolt of revulsion through me. Beneath it there was no blood, no muscle, no bone. There was nothing but another face staring back at me. Another me. A second layer, untouched, unchanged, unmarked. The figure let the torn skin fall to the ground, its expression exactly the same, its eyes locked onto mine with something deeper than recognition now. Understanding. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my stomach twisting, my mind fighting to keep hold of itself. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I had to wake up. I had to find a way out. The town around me seemed to breathe, the buildings stretching taller, the windows widening, the streets twisting underfoot like they were no longer made of solid ground. The figures in the doorways and windows didn't move, but they were closer now, no longer confined to the edges of my vision. I turned sharply, my chest tight, my breath ragged. I needed to run, needed to move, needed to do something before the walls of this place closed in completely. The church behind me loomed, but I couldn't go back inside. The general store, the diner, the houses, they were all the same. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to go. And then, for the first time since I had woken up in this cursed town, I saw something new. A door. It stood at the far end of the street, nestled between two buildings that I was sure hadn't been there moments ago. It wasn't part of a house, wasn't attached to anything at all. It simply stood on its own, a tall wooden door, slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the narrow opening. I had no reason to believe it was safe, but I had even less reason to believe that staying here was. I ran. The town didn't like that. The whispers swelled, rising into something between a scream and a wail, the voices overlapping in frantic, fevered desperation. The ground shifted beneath me, the air thickened, the shadows reached, stretching long fingers across the pavement, curling around my ankles, pulling. The figures moved now, no longer passive, no longer waiting. They stepped forward in unison, slow at first, but then faster, their shapes blurring, their edges unraveling, their darkness spilling outward like ink spreading across the world. But I didn't stop. I reached the door, my hand slamming against the rough wood, my fingers gripping the edge. It felt solid, real. The first thing in this town that wasn't trying to trick me, trying to trap me. I could feel something on the other side, something pulling, something waiting. I yanked it open. The darkness inside wasn't empty. It was full of movement, full of shapes shifting in the void, full of the same whispering voices that had followed me from the moment I had woken up here. But they weren't accusing me anymore. They weren't angry. They were calling me home. I hesitated. And then the figure behind me spoke one last time. You can't outrun it. You never could. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. But it wasn't there anymore. The street was empty. The figures were gone. The buildings were still. The windows blank. The doorways nothing more than hollow spaces. The town had gone silent again. The door stood open before me, the darkness waiting. And for the first time, I realized I had a choice. Stay, or finally remember what I had spent so long trying to forget. The door stood open before me, its darkness stretching deep, endless, unknowable. I couldn't see what lay beyond, couldn't tell if it was another part of the town or something else entirely, but I could feel it. A pull, like a slow, steady current dragging me toward it. An invitation wrapped in inevitability. The whispering had stopped. The figures had vanished. The town had gone still. And yet, I had never felt more watched than I did in that moment, standing on the threshold of something I didn't understand. I hesitated, my breath uneven, my mind screaming at me to turn away, to close the door, to fight against the pull that was urging me forward. But the truth had been circling me since the moment I had woken up in this place, creeping in through the cracks, threading itself through the whispers, through the accusations, through the face that had mirrored mine with unsettling precision. I had spent every moment denying it, but I couldn't anymore. Because deep down, I already knew. I stepped forward. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The air thickened, the silence deepened, and the door behind me slammed shut with a sound that echoed through my bones. The darkness didn't swallow me completely. Instead, it gave way to something new, something impossibly familiar. A house. Not a strange, forgotten place like the buildings in the town, but one I knew. One I had been in before. The walls were the color of old parchment, the wooden floors scratched from years of footsteps, the furniture worn but sturdy, holding the weight of too many memories. The air smelled faintly of dust, of something warm and faded, something like home. And yet there was no comfort in it, because I knew where I was. I have been here before, not yesterday, not last year, but years ago, long enough that it should have been buried, long enough that I had forced myself to forget. And yet, the house had not forgotten me. A sound drifted from down the hall. Soft, rhythmic. Laughter. Not just any laughter. Children. A sharp, involuntary breath left my lips, my body stiffening as I turned toward the sound, my pulse hammering in my ears. I walked forward slowly, each step feeling heavier, as if the floor itself wanted to hold me back, wanted to keep me from reaching what waited at the end of the hall. The light was dim, flickering, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted, warping the edges of the walls, making the hallway seem longer than it should have been. And then I reached the doorway. The room beyond was small, filled with soft light, the air warmer here, thick with something fragile and distant. A wooden table sat at the center, covered in papers, drawings scribbled in bright colors, the uneven scrawl of childish handwriting marking the edges. Small chairs surrounded it, some pushed back haphazardly, as if their occupants had left in a hurry. And standing by the far wall, backs turned to me, were 3 small figures. Children. They weren't shadows, weren't blurred figures hiding in windows, weren't whispering voices drifting through empty streets. They were real as the room itself, as real as the air in my lungs, as real as the crushing weight pressing against my chest. They were looking at a wall covered in more drawings, pinned up in neat rows, pictures of houses, of trees, of people holding hands. But there was one that stood apart, centered among the rest, larger, the lines darker, bolder. A house, drawn in thick black strokes, the windows scribbled out, the door left open, a single figure standing outside of it, alone. The smallest child reached up and traced a finger over the drawing, their voice quiet, almost distant. "He left," they said. The second child, slightly taller, nodded, their voice softer but just as certain. "He promised he wouldn't." The third turned then, slowly, their face still half hidden in shadow, but I didn't need to see it to know. I knew them. I had always known them. The weight of it crashed over me all at once, stealing my breath, sending a sharp, unbearable ache through my chest. I staggered back, my mind reeling, my thoughts unraveling, breaking apart like something delicate that had been, and held together by sheer will alone. I had told myself I didn't know them, that this town was a stranger to me, that these voices were mistaken. But it had never been true. I did know them. I had left them. The town wasn't punishing me for something I didn't understand. It was forcing me to see what I had spent my whole life trying to forget. Memories surged forward, breaking through the barriers I had built, flooding me with images, voices, moments that had once been mine. The house wasn't just familiar. It had been mine. These children weren't just ghosts of a forgotten place. They had been mine too. And I had walked away. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't coming from the shadows. They were coming from me. "You left them," I whispered, my own voice hollow, broken. I left them. The children turned fully now, their faces clear, their eyes wide and sad, their small hands reaching out, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something worse, with longing, with the desperate, unspoken question that had haunted this town, that had seeped into its streets, into its walls, into the very air itself. Why? I couldn't answer. I didn't know if there was an answer. I had run from it for so long, buried it so deep, convinced myself that I had been right, that I had no choice, that leaving had been necessary. But standing there, looking at them, feeling the weight of all those years press down on me at once, I knew the truth. I had abandoned them. And the town had brought me back to remember. The doorway behind me was gone now. There was no exit, no escape, no waking up from this. The house had closed around me, sealing me inside, holding me in the past I had tried to erase. The children stepped closer. Their hands touched mine. And the world shattered. The moment their hands touched mine, the air shifted, thickening with something I couldn't name, something that curled into my lungs and made it hard to breathe. It wasn't cold, not in the way I expected. It wasn't sharp or sudden. It was slow, creeping, the kind of sensation that starts at the edges and works its way inward until it becomes everything. I tried to pull back, but my body wouldn't move. My fingers had gone numb where their small hands gripped mine. And for a brief, terrible moment, I wondered if I was even real anymore, if I had already become part of whatever this was, and just hadn't realized it yet. The children were staring at me now, their eyes wide and searching, their faces filled with something I didn't understand, something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. They weren't angry, weren't accusing, weren't whispering the words that had followed me through the streets of the empty town. But their silence was worse. It was heavier. It was final. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came. What could I possibly say? That I was sorry? That I hadn't meant to leave them? That I had convinced myself I had no choice? None of it would matter. None of it would change the truth. The truth was that I had left, and they had stayed behind, and whatever had happened after that had sealed this place in time, had trapped them here, waiting for me to return. A low sound echoed through the house, a slow creaking, as if the walls themselves were exhaling. The room around me seemed to shift, the edges blurring, the colors deepening, as if everything was sinking into something darker, something older. The children still hadn't let go. Their grip was firmer now, their small fingers curling tighter around mine, holding me in place, holding me inside this moment. I felt something pulling at me. Not physically, not like hands dragging me down, but deeper inside, in the space where thoughts and memories and regrets lived. I was being unmade, piece by piece, undone by the weight of what I had tried so hard to forget. And for the first time, I stopped fighting it. The moment I let go, the world cracked apart. The house shattered, splintering into fragments of light and shadow, dissolving around me like smoke caught in the wind. The floor beneath my feet vanished. The walls crumbled. The ceiling split open into nothing. For a brief, dizzying moment, I was nowhere, caught in the space between what had been and what was coming next. And then I was standing in the town square again. The wooden bench was back. The buildings were still. The church stood tall, its steeple reaching into the endless gray sky. The roads stretched in every direction, winding through the town, leading nowhere, leading everywhere. The air was thick with silence, heavy and unmoving, pressing in from all sides. And the town was no longer empty. They were all there now. The people I had seen in the photographs inside the church. The men, the women, the children, the ones whose eyes had been scratched away. They stood in the streets, on the sidewalks, in the doorways of the houses, silent, still, watching, waiting. I turned in a slow circle, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. They weren't whispering anymore. The accusation that had chased me through the streets, that had haunted my every step, was gone, because they no longer needed to say it. I understood now. I was one of them. I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see them fading, turning to shadow, becoming part of the town the way everything else had. But they were solid, real. I could still feel the rough texture of my skin, the weight of my own body standing on the cracked pavement. But something was different. Something had shifted. I no longer felt like I was trapped. I no longer felt like I needed to escape. The town had never been holding me here. It had been waiting for me to come back. The silence stretched, long and unbroken, and then, slowly, the people began to move. Not all at once, not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate way, like they had all been frozen in time and were just now remembering how to exist. Some stepped forward, their faces tilting slightly as if they were studying me, as if they were seeing me clearly for the first time. And then the whispers returned. Not a warning, not an accusation, a welcome. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest unraveling, the weight of something old and heavy lifting just enough for me to breathe again. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't running anymore. I stepped forward. The people of the town parted for me, making space, creating a path that led through the streets, past the buildings, past the places where I had tried so desperately to find a way out. I wasn't leaving. I had never been meant to leave. The town had been waiting for me. And now, finally, I had come home. It started as an assignment, just another job. I'm a journalist, the kind that chases after ghost stories and urban legends. The abandoned Blackwood Asylum was a local legend, a place spoken of in whispers, a place people crossed the street to avoid. They said it was cursed, that the patients never left, that the ones who stepped inside never came back the same. But those were just stories, right? The asylum loomed on the edge of town, swallowed by time and rot. The iron gates stood open, as if inviting me inside. My footsteps crunched against gravel, echoing in the silence. The air smelled of damp wood and something else. Something sour. Something old. I hesitated at the entrance. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently, even though there was no wind. I should have turned back. Instead, I stepped inside. The air was thick, like it hadn't moved in years. Dust swirled in the dim light filtering through broken windows. The place was massive, stretching into darkness, its hallways yawning like open mouths. And then I heard it. A whisper. Low, faint, coming from deep within the asylum. It sent a chill down my spine. Just the wind, I told myself. Just the building settling. But my hands were already clammy, my heartbeat just a little too fast. I pulled out my flashlight, sweeping it across the ruined walls. Rusted gurneys, torn restraints. Medical charts littered the floor, their pages yellowed and brittle. And then I saw the writing, scrawled along the walls in frantic, jagged letters. "Don't let them see you." A shiver ran through me. My flashlight flickered just for a second. When the light steadied, I swore the words looked smeared, as if someone had just written them. I shook it off. Just my nerves. Just my imagination. I pushed deeper into the asylum. Each step felt heavier, the silence pressing against my ears. I peered into empty rooms, beds overturned, glass shattered, walls peeling. But then, I reached the patient wing. That's when I heard it. A scream, high, piercing, coming from inside one of the rooms. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. I turned slowly, flashlight trembling in my grip. The room ahead was open, just a crack. Darkness pooled beyond it, and then, just as suddenly as it started, the screaming stopped. I swallowed hard. No, that didn't make sense. The asylum was abandoned. It had been for decades. No one was supposed to be here. And yet, I wasn't alone. A rustling sound, a shuffle. Footsteps? They were coming from the hallway behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just a long, empty corridor stretching into darkness. My own breath was too loud in my ears. My own heartbeat thudding too fast. Then, another noise. A whisper. Right next to my ear. "Stay." The flashlight slipped from my fingers. The flashlight hit the ground with a dull clatter, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the thick, suffocating silence of the asylum. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen in place as if I had been turned to stone. The word, "stay," still echoed in my ears, not spoken, not heard in the way normal voices should be, but felt, breathed directly into my bones. For a moment, I told myself it was my imagination, that fear was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore the icy prickle crawling up my spine, the way the darkness around me suddenly felt more solid, pressing in, watching. I forced myself to move, to bend down and grab my flashlight, my fingers trembling as I wrapped them around the cold metal. When I turned it back on, the beam cut through the dimness, illuminating the empty hallway before me. Empty. Completely and utterly empty. But I wasn't fooled. I knew something had been there. Something had spoken to me. My heart hammered as I turned back toward the room where I had heard the scream. The door was still ajar, its dark wooden frame warped with age, paint peeling away in long, curling strips. Every part of me screamed to leave, to turn around and walk back the way I had come. But I wasn't that kind of person. I wasn't the kind to run. I had spent my entire career chasing the unknown, laughing in the face of superstition, pushing forward when others turned back. But right now, I wasn't laughing. I reached out and pushed the door open, the old hinges groaning in protest, the sound stretching out too long, almost as if something unseen was resisting, holding it closed. When it finally gave way, the room before me was empty. A single bed, its mattress rotted and torn, a rusted wheelchair near the window, a tangle of straps bolted to the floor, their leather cracked with age. But then I saw the walls. Deep scratches marred the surface, jagged lines carved into the plaster, as if by fingernails, wild and desperate. And the words, so many words, etched into the walls over and over again, in uneven, shaken G script. Let me out, let me out, let me out, let me out. Over and over, hundreds of times, thousands. I took a step back, my stomach twisting, a deep, terrible unease curling through my chest. This wasn't just some abandoned building. This place had been alive once, filled with suffering, with pain, and the echoes of that suffering still lingered, still clung to the very walls, to the air itself. A creak sounded behind me. Slow, deliberate. I turned too quickly, my breath catching in my throat, my flashlight swinging wildly to catch whatever had moved. The hallway was empty, but the air had changed. It felt heavier, thicker. And then I heard it again. The whisper. Closer this time. You shouldn't be here. I staggered back, my heel catching on something, sending me stumbling to the floor. My flashlight rolled from my grip again, spinning wildly until it stopped, its beam now pointing directly at the doorway. And that was when I saw them. Silhouettes, standing just beyond the threshold. Not solid, not fully formed, shifting shapes, barely more than shadows, but I could see them, could feel their presence pressing against my skin like a thick, stifling fog. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures didn't move, didn't come closer, but they didn't leave either. They simply stood there, watching, waiting. Then, all at once, they vanished. The air in the room seemed to rush back in, the suffocating pressure lifting just slightly, but I knew better than to believe they were gone. They weren't gone. They were still here. Somewhere. Watching. I grabbed my flashlight and backed toward the hallway, my steps slow, careful, my body tense, ready to run. But then, just as I reached the doorway, something changed. The air shifted again, colder this time, sharper. And then, from deep within the asylum, from somewhere far beyond where I had ventured, a new sound began to rise. Screaming. Not one voice, not two, but dozens, hundreds. A chorus of agony, of fear, of something far worse than anything I had ever heard before. It filled the air, vibrating against the walls, the floor, my very bones. And then, beneath the screams, just barely audible, a single, whispering voice cut through the noise. "You're one of us now." And the door behind me slammed shut. The sound of the door slamming shut behind me was like a gunshot in the stillness, so loud and final that I could feel the vibrations echo through my chest. My body jerked instinctively, every muscle coiling tight as I spun around, my breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The door stood there, solid and unyielding, its surface warped with age, its handle now nothing more than a rusted, useless piece of metal. I lunged for it anyway, my fingers grasping at the cold brass, twisting, pulling, yanking with all my strength. Nothing. It wouldn't budge. A deep panic clawed its way up my throat as I braced my shoulder against the wood and shoved, my mind racing, my breathing coming too fast. The door didn't move, not even an inch, as if something on the other side was holding it shut, pressing against it with a force far greater than my own. The screams that had filled the air only moments ago had faded now, swallowed back into the depths of the asylum like they had never existed. But I knew they had. I had heard them. I had felt them. I forced myself to turn around, my flashlight gripped tightly in my shaking hand. The beam wavered as I swept it across the room again, searching for any sign of movement, for any hint of the shadowy figures I had seen before. But the room was empty. No figures. No shifting shapes lingering in the corners. Just the words carved into the walls, their presence even more suffocating now that I was trapped inside with them. "Let me out! Let me out! Let me out!" I couldn't look at them anymore. I turned away, forcing my attention to the rest of the room, my mind racing through my options. There had to be another way out. A window, a vent, something. I hurried toward the nearest window, its frame warped and broken, the glass long shattered. But as I reached it, I felt my stomach drop. The outside was gone. Not darkness, not fog, not even the night sky pressing against the broken glass. Just nothing. An empty, hollow void stretching out in all directions, vast and endless, as if the world beyond the asylum had simply ceased to exist. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse hammering against my ribs. This wasn't possible. I had seen the outside when I walked in. I had seen the trees, the road, the decaying fence that marked the asylum's perimeter. But now there was nothing. A slow, creeping dread curled around me, its grip tight and unrelenting. I took a step back from the window, then another, my mind screaming at me to wake up, to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no sense to be found here. Nothing about this place followed the rules of reality. Then, from somewhere deep within the asylum, the whispers returned. Faint at first, no more than a breath of sound, like wind through dry leaves. But they grew louder, overlapping, twisting into something almost intelligible, words slipping through the static. "We see you. We know you. You cannot leave." I turned in a slow, shuddering movement, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The hallway beyond the doorway was no longer empty. They were there. Not shadows this time, not half-formed shapes lingering at the edge of my vision. They stood in the corridor, fully formed, fully present, their faces turned toward me. Patience. That was the only word my mind could grasp, the only thing that made sense in a place like this. They were dressed in thin, tattered hospital gowns, their bodies pale, skeletal, their eyes dark, hollow pits that seemed to pull the light from the air. Their mouths hung open, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. One of them took a step forward, then another. The others followed, their bare feet dragging against the floor, slow, deliberate, their movements eerily synchronized. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs, my body screaming for me to run, even though there was nowhere to go. The door behind me. I spun and pounded my fists against the wood, my palms stinging, my voice ragged as I screamed for help, for anyone, for something to let me out. The patients were closer now, their breath rattling, their hollow eyes fixed on me with something between hunger and recognition. One of them reached out. I felt it before I saw it. A sudden searing cold against the back of my neck, like fingers made of ice pressing into my skin. A jolt of pain shot down my spine, a deep, twisting agony that rooted me to the spot, my vision blurring, the room spinning around me. The whispers surged, overlapping, growing louder, filling my head with voices that didn't belong to me. They told me things. They showed me things. Flashes of the past, of this place when it was still alive, when the walls weren't crumbling and the screams weren't echoes. Patients strapped to beds, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. Doctors standing over them, their faces hidden behind surgical masks, their hands gloved and steady as they injected something into trembling arms, as they whispered reassurances that meant nothing. "You'll be better soon," one of them said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "We're going to help you." The image twisted, shifted. A woman strapped to a chair, her arms bound, her head forced back as a machine roared to life. Electricity crackled. And then nothing. Darkness. Cold. And the whispering voices, always whispering, always waiting. I gasped as the vision snapped away, my knees hitting the floor, my entire body shaking with something I couldn't name. The patients were gone. The whispers had stopped. And when I looked down at my arms, I saw the straps, tight, secure, holding me in place. And in the dim light, the faded print of a hospital gown clung to my skin. At first, I refused to believe what I was seeing. My mind recoiled, rejecting the very idea that the soft, paper-thin fabric clinging to my arms, to my chest, to my legs could possibly be real. My breathing hitched as I reached for the straps binding my wrists, my fingers fumbling against the rough, cracked leather, my nails digging into the buckles as I tried to pry them loose. But they held firm, fastened too tightly, as if they had been there for years, as if they had always been there. No, this wasn't right. This wasn't real. I forced myself to look around, to take in my surroundings again, to ground myself in something solid, something that made sense. But the room had changed. It was no longer the decayed, crumbling shell of a hospital room that I had first stepped into. The walls were no longer peeling, the windows no longer shattered. The floor was clean, the air thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic, and something else, something metallic, something wrong. The words that had been scratched into the walls, the desperate pleas for escape, were gone. The room was alive again. I wasn't in an abandoned asylum anymore. I was in Blackwood, as it had been in its prime, in the days when the patients still walked the halls, when the doctors still wore their pristine white coats, when the machines hummed and buzzed with the promise of progress. The past wasn't a memory here. It was a place. And I was in it. A sound drifted in from the hallway beyond my door. Footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate. Not the shuffling, dragging steps of the figures I had seen before, but something else, something heavier. Someone was coming. I yanked at the straps again, my breath coming faster, panic rising in my throat like bile. The leather dug into my skin, burning against my wrists as I struggled, my muscles aching with the effort. My heart slammed against my ribs as the footsteps grew closer, each one echoing through the silence, each one heavier than the last. Then the door opened. He stood in the doorway, tall and rigid, his presence filling the room with something cold, something suffocating. His white coat was immaculate, his hands tucked behind his back in a way that felt too controlled, too rehearsed. His face was sharp, his features carved into a mask of professionalism. But his eyes were the worst part. They were hollow, bottomless, twin voids that seemed to pull the air from the room, that seemed to know too much. The head doctor. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. His presence was undeniable, his authority absolute. He stepped forward, the door closing softly behind him, sealing us in together. "You shouldn't be awake yet," he said, his voice smooth, clinical, detached, as if he were commenting on the weather, as if my struggling, my panic, my very existence meant nothing at all. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, raw, like I had been screaming for hours, for days, for years. The doctor tilted his head slightly, watching me, studying me. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. My notebook. The one I had brought with me. The one I had used to take notes, to document my findings, to record every unsettling thing I had seen since stepping into this place. But when he opened it, the pages weren't filled with my notes. They weren't filled with my careful handwriting, my observations, my thoughts. They were filled with names, hundreds of names, thousands, written over and over again in frantic, desperate script, the ink smudged in places, the paper torn in others, and beneath the names, scrawled in uneven letters, were 3 words that made my blood run cold. "You belong here." The doctor closed the notebook and slipped it back into his coat, his expression unreadable. "We've been waiting for you," he said. I shook my head, my body trembling, my breath coming too fast. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. I had walked into an abandoned asylum, an empty building, a place long forgotten by the world. I had come here to investigate, to uncover the truth, to write an article that would expose the horrors that had once taken place in these walls. I hadn't come here to stay. The doctor stepped closer, and I could feel the air shift around him, could feel the weight of his presence pressing against my skin, against my mind. He reached for something behind me, and before I could react, before I could fight, before I could even scream, the straps around my wrists released with a soft click. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. My body remained frozen, my muscles locked in place, my mind screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but my limbs refused to obey. "Good," the doctor murmured, almost to himself. "You're adjusting faster than the others." The others? I forced myself to look up, forced my body to respond, forced my voice to work. "Who are you?" I rasped, my throat dry, my voice barely more than a whisper. The doctor smiled, but there was no warmth in it, no kindness. You already know. And deep down, in the hollow pit of my stomach, in the place where fear lived, I realized that I did. I had known since the moment I stepped inside. Blackwood Asylum had never been abandoned. The patients had never left. And now, neither had I. Something inside me shattered at those words, splintering into jagged fragments that cut through my mind like glass. I wanted to deny it, to scream that it wasn't true, that this was just another nightmare conjured by the asylum's cursed walls. But deep down, in the quiet place where truth cannot be ignored, I knew. I knew I had made a mistake stepping into this place. I knew that the warnings had been more than just stories. And I knew, oh God, I knew, that I didn't have long before the last pieces of myself were swallowed whole. The doctor watched me with the patient amusement of a man who had seen this moment play out countless times before, as if he knew exactly what I was thinking, exactly how my mind was unraveling. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't try to force anything upon me. He just waited. Because he knew I would come to the only conclusion left. I had walked into Blackwood Asylum as a journalist. I would not walk out at all. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing down on my chest like an unseen weight, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. The silence was suffocating, thick with something unspoken, something inevitable. The walls around me no longer felt like walling, at all, but like living things, like lungs inhaling and exhaling, waiting for me to stop struggling, waiting for me to accept that I belonged to them now. I forced myself to move, to shake off the paralysis threatening to consume me. My fingers curled against my palms, my nails biting into my skin, grounding me in the only reality I had left: pain. I wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. Not ever. My legs felt weak as I pushed myself off the chair, my knees nearly buckling beneath me, but I didn't stop. I stumbled forward, my eyes locked on the doctor, searching for any hint of humanity in his expression, any crack in the mask he wore so effortlessly. But there was none. "You're wrong," I whispered, my voice hoarse, my throat raw from the screams I barely remembered. "I don't belong here." The doctor simply tilted his head, considering me the way a scientist might consider an insect pinned beneath glass. "Denial is always the last stage," he said, almost kindly. "You will understand soon enough." A cold panic slithered through me, coiling around my spine, sinking its claws into the fragile hope I had been clinging to. No, I wouldn't let this happen. I had come here to uncover the truth, to expose whatever horrors had been buried in these walls, and I had found them. Now, I just needed to escape. I took a slow, steadying breath, my mind racing through every possible exit, every possible weakness in this place's hold on me. The door was closed, but I had seen no locks, no bars. The window, if it still led to nothingness, I would deal with that when the time came. But I would not stay. The doctor must have seen something shift in my expression, because he sighed, almost disappointed, almost bored. "You'll only make it harder for yourself," he said, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. I lunged. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just moved. My body reacted before my mind could process what I was doing, and I threw all my weight against the door, shoving it open so violently that it slammed against the wall outside. My feet hit the hallway, and I ran. The lights above me flickered as I sprinted down the corridor, their glow twisting, warping, stretching the shadows along the walls into long, grasping fingers. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the electric charge of something unnatural, something waking up. The whispers started again, rising and falling like waves, their voices overlapping, merging, calling my name. Not my name. The name of a patient. My stomach twisted, nausea rolling through me, but I didn't slow down. Doors lined the hallway on either side, their windows dark, their rooms filled with the unknown. I didn't dare look inside. I knew what I would see. Movement flickered at the edges of my vision, shapes shifting, bodies stirring, faces turning toward me as I ran past. The patients. They were waking up. A hand shot out from one of the doorways, fingers clawing at my wrist, cold and unyielding. I wrenched myself free with a strangled gasp, the sensation of those fingers lingering like frostbite. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything but the desperate animalistic need to get out. I could see it now. The front doors. They loomed at the end of the hallway, massive and imposing, the last barrier between me and the world beyond. But something was wrong. The closer I got, the farther away they seemed, the hallway stretching impossibly, warping like a living thing trying to keep me inside. No. I was not going to let this place take me. I pushed forward, forcing my legs to move faster, my breath tearing from my throat in ragged gasps. The whispers became screams, the walls trembled, the shadows deepened. But I didn't stop. And then I reached the doors. I didn't think. I just grabbed the handle and pulled. For one terrible, soul-crushing moment, nothing happened. The asylum held me in place, clinging to me, wrapping its invisible chains around my wrists, my ankles, my mind. But then, a crack, a fissure in reality itself. The doors burst open with a force that sent me sprawling onto the ground outside, the impact jolting through my bones, knocking the breath from my lungs. The cold night air hit me like a slap, sharp and bracing. And for the first time since stepping into this nightmare, I realized something. I was free. I gasped for air, my hands grasping at the dirt beneath me, the rough texture anchoring me in the present, in reality. My body trembled, every muscle screaming in protest, but I didn't care. I was alive. I turned back toward the asylum, expecting to see the doors still open, expecting to see figures standing in the threshold, watching me, waiting for me to return. But there was nothing. The doors were closed. The building stood silent, motionless, as if it had never stirred at all. Had it been real? My hands fumbled for my notebook, desperate, to see proof, to remind myself that I hadn't imagined it all. But when I opened it, the pages were filled with names. Pages and pages of patient names. My stomach dropped as I flipped through, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. And then, on the last page, my blood turned to ice. Because there, written in the same desperate scrawl as the others, was my name. I slammed the notebook shut, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my vision swimming. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. And then, from the asylum behind me, the lights flickered on. I didn't move. I couldn't. My breath was caught somewhere in my throat, frozen by the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. The asylum, the same dead and abandoned structure I had stepped into hours ago, was no longer dark. Its windows glowed with a sickly yellow light, flickering and unsteady, as if the building had taken a deep breath and woken up. It wasn't supposed to do that. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind, that my nerves were shot, that my exhaustion was twisting the world into something worse than it really was. But then I heard it. The sound of something shifting inside. The soft, shuffling movement of feet against tile. the distant murmur of voices speaking just below the edge of understanding. The asylum wasn't just awake. It was alive. I stumbled backward, my body screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as humanly possible. But I didn't. Not yet. My fingers curled tighter around my notebook, my pulse pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear my own ragged breaths. I needed to check. I needed to be sure. With shaking hands, I flipped back through the pages, skimming over the names, over the frantic, scrawled writing that didn't belong to me. Every name felt heavy, pressing against my skull like weights, their presence undeniable, inescapable. They were real. They had been here. And so had I. I turned to the last page again, dreading what I already knew I would see. My name was still there, etched into the paper as if it had been written 1,000 times before. The ink was dark, smudged in places where the pen had pressed too hard, as though the writer had been desperate, frantic. I traced the letters with my fingertips, my breath shuddering in my chest. This couldn't be happening. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, as if holding it tighter could make the words inside disappear, could erase the truth that was clawing its way to the surface of my mind. I was supposed to be free. I had made it out. I could feel the night air against my skin, the cold ground beneath me, the weight of my own exhaustion settling into my bones. But the asylum wasn't done with me. I took another step back, my eyes still locked on the building, its glowing windows like watching eyes, unblinking and patient. And then, just as I convinced myself to turn away, to run, to leave it all behind, something moved. A shadow passed by one of the windows. I felt my entire body go rigid, my stomach lurching violently as the figure inside turned, slowly, deliberately, until it was facing me. I couldn't see details, couldn't make out a face, but I didn't need to. Because it was me. Not someone who looked like me, not some trick of the light or illusion of my rattled mind. It was me, standing inside the asylum, looking out, watching. My breath hitched in my throat, my vision tunneling as my pulse slammed against my ribs. I took another step back, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, but the figure inside didn't move. It just stood there, staring, waiting. A low electric hum filled the air, the same deep vibration I had felt inside the asylum, the same unnatural pull that had wrapped around me the moment I stepped through its doors. The notebook in my hands felt heavier now, the weight of it dragging me down, anchoring me to something I didn't want to understand. I forced myself to move, to turn away, to start walking. My legs felt unsteady, my entire body shaking with the lingering echoes of whatever had happened inside that place. But I didn't stop. I walked past the rusted gate, past the overgrown path that had once led me here, past the remnants of the world I thought I knew. I didn't look back. But as I reached my car, my hands fumbling to pull open the door, I heard it. A whisper. Not from behind me. Not from the asylum. From inside the car. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get in, to drive, to leave this place in the rearview mirror and never return. But I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, hesitantly, I leaned forward, peering through the window. The reflection staring back at me was not my own. The face was mine, the features identical, the eyes the same shade of tired and terrified. But it wasn't me. The lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. And then, in a voice that was my own, and yet not, it spoke. You never left. The world tilted, the night twisting around me, the ground beneath my feet shifting like sand. My vision blurred, my pulse stuttering, my thoughts unraveling. And then, darkness. No sound, no air, no time. And somewhere, in the far distance, beyond the veil of reality, the asylum lights flickered, waiting for the next one.